and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's talk. We are going to get started by having Dr. Galaria welcome the audience and our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Roberta. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important conversation and discussion. And thank you to the Jefferson Office of Alumni Relations, specifically Roberta and Jeff, for bringing this, making this possible and bringing this event to us tonight. My name is Irfan Galaria. I'm a plastic and reconstructive surgeon in Northern Virginia. I graduated from the Sidney Kimmel Medical College in 2001. And I've been fortunate to be serving on the alumni board of the Sidney Kimmel Medical College for the past 2 or 3 years. As part of the alumni board's mission to support the medical college and the students at the medical college, we've created what we call the I.D.E.A initiative. I.D.E.A is an acronym that stands for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Alliance. And the initiative was developed to engage medical college and postgraduate alumni and to support current students of diverse shared experiences and identities. The I.D.E.A initiative has 2 main goals. The first is to provide support to current medical students. And we hope to do this in several ways. By 1, sharing our experiences, 2, by providing advice and mentorship, and 3, by sponsoring relevant programs and events such as the one you're going to hear tonight. Our second main goal is to connect and reconnect alumni from minority populations with fellow alums, with current students, with the association, and with the university. On a personal note, I'm sincerely grateful that the Alumni Board has taken on this initiative. As a Muslim and of Indian origin, I've certainly been in spaces and I've been in places where I've felt excluded or simply just misunderstood because of my background. And I hope efforts and programs like today's presentation will promote greater inclusion and understanding. Of course, the Alumni Board is not alone. The university and the medical college have been working hard over the past several years, in particular, to promote inclusion and diversity within the medical college and the university. And Dr. Bernard Lopez has been a consistent champion and driving force for these efforts. And I'm glad he's here today so he can share his experiences with us. Dr. Lopez is professor and executive vice chair in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University. Dr. Lopez also serves as a senior associate dean for diversity and community engagement and is the associate provost for diversity and inclusion at Thomas Jefferson University. Today, Dr. Lopez will be talking about LGBTQ allyship and what is it. He'll share the history and impact of this community's journey towards equity and inclusion, and he'll share ways and opportunities for us to support our colleagues and friends. So Dr. Lopez, thank you again for being here today, and I'm honored that you'll be presenting today during the I.D.E.A initiative's first official program. Dr. Lopez, I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Great. Well, Dr. Galaria, thank you so much for that. Those kind words. It is truly a pleasure to be here tonight. All right, so, well, I guess you're, well, actually, welcome to all the alums, welcome to the students, welcome to those, all of you who are here tonight, if you're on the East Coast, late this afternoon, if you're further out west, but really is a pleasure to be here and talk with you about this particular topic. So you heard all of my titles. Yes, I'm a Jefferson lifer. I started medical school in 1982 and have really spent my entire professional career at Jefferson in some form or other. Really, it's been about 8 years that I've been involved in diversity work, first starting out as the Dean of Diversity in the medical school, but then several years ago, also taking on the role as provost for the entire university. So this is my life's work at this point. Yes, I'm still a practicing emergency physician, something that is still near and dear to my heart, but much of the work that I do is in diversity, inclusion, and equity. All right, so you heard all of my titles. This is the typical way we start our talks with all of our professional titles. Well, What I want to share with you are probably equally important titles when I give a talk such as this. All right, so I want you to know that the talk that I'm going to give is from my own perspective. It's largely my perspective about, my life experiences. I've been on this earth for a little bit of time, so my life's experiences, my experiences in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but my experiences and my views as a cisgender heterosexual male. I'm largely in the majority. I'm Asian American. But for the most part, for much of my life, much of my career, I live in a majority world. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I like to think of myself as an ally. And we're going to get into this in a little bit about what does it actually mean to be an ally. Happy Pride Month. I think that certainly the topic of this particular session is driven largely by the fact that the month of June is Pride Month. I show you a couple pictures here. We were, with all the restrictions being lifted in the area, this is from New Jersey. There was a Pride parade last week in Haddonfield, New Jersey. It's where Jefferson, New Jersey, one of our divisions, has the LGBTQ Health Center. They actually had a Pride parade, 150 Jeffersonians strong at the Pride parade. So again, happy Pride Month. This is why we're doing this particular talk, in part in celebration of Pride Month. What we're going to do today is we're going to we will talk about allyship, but part of allyship is understanding the history. It's a really big part. When we get to that definition of what does an ally mean, what do they do, a good part of it is understanding the history that's involved, because then it gives you a better understanding of why being an ally, why work as an ally is so important. So we're going to talk about the origin of Pride Month, relevant LGBTQ history. I'm going to show you a little bit about disparities that exist in healthcare. And we're all, I think most of us that are on this call are either practicing physicians, we are going to be practicing physicians, or it's likely that if you're not a physician, you're in healthcare in some way. So I just want to touch a little bit on disparities that we see in providing healthcare. And then we're going to talk a little bit about allyship. All right, so I don't know how many of you, by virtue of being on this particular call, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. So I don't know, this is a picture of the Stonewall Inn in New York. So when you think about Pride Month, and it's not just, well, it started here, but in reality, Pride Month originated from the events at this Stonewall Inn. So what I want to do is share a little video with you to get a better understanding of the history, the beginning of Pride Month. All right, so, well, a little bit of history. Certainly the beginning part of that video talked about the riots at Stonewall in the Pride Month. Really, people got together a year later to commemorate, and it wasn't big like it is today, but it really stemmed from that. It became a yearly remembrance of the Stonewall Inn riots. You might say one of the first times that the LGBTQ community stood up to the discrimination that they faced. So that was the beginning of that video, and then some of the morbid history of the viewpoint. So you saw the dates in 1967. So 50 some years ago. Really, some of the history behind how people thought. So a little bit more history. Part of allyship is truly understanding and being knowledgeable about the history. history of discrimination and disparities. And I think once you get at least a little bit of a taste of history, you get an idea of why allyship is so important. So what I'm going to do next is just kind of go through some of the key events, the key happenings over the last almost century or so, just to give you a little bit of a flavor. You know, we've seen with the video some of the history, went through Stonewall Inn, gay pride. We went through some of the events that happened in history. So I just want to give you a little bit more detail. You know, over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, it's really hitting some of the highlights. Obviously, we can't cover everything, and that short amount of time doesn't do justice. And my hope is that you'll explore even further, delve into some more of that history to make that understanding even more deep. So let's start in the 1930s and 1940s. So, you know, almost 100 years or so ago, the idea of LGBTQ, of queer people, was just not very commonplace in society. There certainly wasn't much publicity around it. And what publicity existed was not very good. So for the most part, if you were in the LGBTQ plus community, you were probably criminalized by society. You were pathologized by medicine. So you were treated really as a true outcast, as if there was something truly wrong with you. We saw in the earlier video, you know, some of the quote treatments, and these were treatments that were essentially forced on to what would otherwise be healthy individuals. So they received this involuntary quote treatment. And this included treatments such as conversion therapy, aversion therapy, shock therapy. They were subjected to surgeries, and oftentimes they were subjected to involuntary psychiatric commitment. So in the 30s and 40s, this was kind of the notion. This was what was happening to this, you know, the community that was otherwise not very well known. How about the 1950s? Well, here we have some evidence here. 1952, homosexuality was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it was listed as an official disease. 1953, Eisenhower bans gays from government service. So you could not work for the government. You were in many ways outright ostracized by the government in terms of employment. The 1960s, the 1970s, so this actually coincided with the civil rights movement, the cultural revolution, you know, those sorts of things, the flower power, those sorts of movements. This was a time of great social change. Here, there's some positive evidence. So evidence, for instance, Illinois decriminalized consensual homosexual acts. So this was one of the first instances of something positive. Illinois, over the years, has been considered very progressive in this area. And this was one piece of evidence of something that has happened in a positive way. We've already talked about the Stonewall riots, the gay pride celebration, you know, that first celebration that has led to what you see today. In 1973, homosexuality was removed from the DSM. Then you also saw, again, some positive movement. So PFLAG, the parents, families, and friends of lesbian and gays, and that's one organization. Lambda Legal. So organizations, large organizations being created to truly support, to truly stand for the rights of those in the LGBTQ plus community. So 1960s, 1970s, some positive movement, some positive events and happenings that we first get to see. The 1980s. So I remember this very well. I was a medical student when HIV and AIDS came about. It was very much an unknown and very much a deadly, deadly disease. Again, not to say that it's not deadly nowadays, but we didn't know much about this. It seemed to affect one community. It was largely gay males that were affected. But the 1980s saw the scourge of HIV and AIDS, and the scourge was not just medical, but it was also societal. AIDS was seen as the disease of gay people. It was seen as perhaps, I don't know, payback for choosing a certain lifestyle. That was how it was viewed. So you can just imagine. So you think about the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. You think about how the LGBTQ plus community was seen. Well, here's a disease that affected largely that same community. And there was not only a lot of stigma associated with it, but at the time, there was not great support for treating this as well as perhaps we probably could. So the 1980s was very big in terms of development and events that affected the LGBTQ plus community, as well as all of the social, political events that happened surrounding it. So in the 1990s, again, you're seeing some positive, some negative, some, I would say, rather negative events in the 1990s. So in 1994, the United States, I'm sorry, 1993, the United States adopted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was the official federal policy on military service by lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. So this was a rule that, well, it allowed you to serve as long as you didn't disclose your identity. So it's really a discriminatory rule. It's really discriminatory rule in its purest sense. And it prevented service by those who are openly gay and if you were at real threat from being discharged from the military. And it was really based on the false assumption, that LGBTQ individuals in any branch of the military would undermine the ability of people to carry out their military duties. In 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act, this was signed by President Bill Clinton, and essentially it prevented same-sex couples whose marriages were recognized by their home states from receiving the many benefits available to other married couples under federal law. So it really recognized marriage as being between a man and a woman, and essentially did not recognize same-sex marriages. High-profile murders. Matthew Shepard in Colorado. Rita Hester. So Rita Hester was a transgender African-American woman murdered in Massachusetts. Again, these were both very high profile and really called attention to the significant discrimination and outright violence against those in the LGBTQ plus community. Again, so we're up to the 1990s. You're seeing largely negative events, negative actions against the LGBTQ plus community. Imagine if or maybe you don't have to imagine, if you are part of this community, these events, these laws, the politics are really in the limelight, and they are highly visible. So you can imagine, or maybe you've experienced what it's like to have, your identity, to have one's identity be a part of current events. In the 2000s, all right, so in the 2000s, there was certainly far more LGBTQ plus representation in the media, on TV and in films. 2002, 2003, the Transgender Law Center, the National Center for Trans Equality were established. Again, you say big centers, big organizations that were formally charged with improving the quality of life for those in the LGBTQ plus community. So in 2003, there was a case, Lawrence versus Texas. This was a landmark decision. So now we're starting to see, this is, you might say, the start of the Supreme Court of the United States being involved in decisions. This case, it was the decision of the Supreme Court that ruled that sanctions of criminal punishment for those who committed sodomy are unconstitutional. All right. In 2008, same-sex marriage was legalized. Now, it was legalized, not very well supported publicly. It really wasn't until 2012 when President Obama publicly supported same-sex marriage. So now something more positive, but you can see it took 4 years before there was true public support for this. In 2016, we had the Pulse nightclub shooting. How about some recent history? In 2010, so over the last 10 years, 2010, something called the It Gets Better campaign. It's really to support the well-being of LGBTQ plus youth, adolescents. In 2011, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was that policy was formally repealed. In 2013, the Defense of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that individual states cannot ban same-sex marriage. In 2017, the District of Columbia allowed for an X on the driver's license. So binary male, female. Here was one of the first times in which something official identification allowed for something other than that binary identification. Also in 2017, President Trump says that transgender individuals cannot enlist in the military. 2018 saw at the midterm elections, transgender and non-conforming LGBTQ individuals became civil servants. They were elected into office. We saw this happen in the most recent elections as well. In 2018, the quote diagnosis of transsexualism was removed from the World Health Organization's International Classification of Disease in version 11. In 2019, we saw a proposal of a bill, or I should say bills that allow healthcare providers to refuse care to the LGBTQ plus community. How about 2021? So we're about halfway through 2021. Again, you see some positive, some negative. Rachel Levine, who is the Secretary of Health for the state of Pennsylvania, was confirmed as Assistant Health Secretary of the United States, the first transgender person to ever be appointed to a federal position such as this. And just very recently, at Supreme Court of the United States unanimously ruled for the Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia. And really, what they ruled was that Philadelphia was trying to, and what they believed was really trying to enforce anti-discrimination laws protecting LGBTQ rights against those claiming religious liberty. The Supreme Court ruled that it was wrong for Philadelphia to end the contract simply because they refused to work with same-sex couples. So their ruling was that the city violated the Constitution's guarantee of free exercise of religion. So in a nutshell, over the last 90-ish years that I covered in this very short time, again, there are many more events, actions that happened over this time. This was really meant as just highlights of just some of them. You can see over time there have been some positive but largely negative events, rulings over this time. So just in this short piece on the history, I hope that you can see why it's important, why allyship for the LGBTQ plus community is truly important. There's a long history. It goes beyond what I just presented here. It goes on for many years previous, but there's a long history of violence and discrimination against LGBTQ plus people. This discrimination, this violence really prevents equity, right? So it leads to inadequate health care. It leads to disparities in jobs, pay, criminal justice system. It creates inaccessibility to resources. And clearly over time, while we've seen some positive, there's really a lack of support from politicians and legislatures. And there's a widespread stigma, as well as a general rejection and forced isolation of a group of people based on their identities. And this sort of history really fosters chronic minority stress in the LGBTQ plus community. It fosters stress on individuals, which leads to all kinds of problems, even beyond health. The long history, discrimination, bias. Now I'm going to pull this back into healthcare. Well, that history, the biases that we hold, they can be unconscious mostly. Perhaps they could even be overt and explicit, but all of these affect the patients that we care for, patient-provider interactions, the treatment decisions that we make. This is from Cook-Ross Incorporated. I use their material when I talk about unconscious bias, but really talking about how one's thoughts, feelings, biases influenced by history, what is seen in society. Ultimately, it affects the care that we provide to the patients that we care for, treatment decisions, patient treatment adherence, and ultimately patient health outcomes. Yeah, if you want evidence, scientific evidence of disparities that are faced by the LGBTQ plus community, I'm going to pull up just three. I have three examples of hundreds of examples of just how, just the types of disparities that are seen. Bisexual orientation, behavioral risk factors. Here's one from my specialties literature, and there was a series of articles in the Annals of Emergency Medicine that really documented what happens in the emergency department. But the title, Sometimes You Feel Like the Freak Show. And this was really an attempt at putting science behind the experiences of our patients in the emergency department. This one was just from last week's Journal of the American Medical Association. Legislation to criminalize gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth. This is actually a scary article to read on a number of fronts. One, It's scary just to read about the disparities that transgender youth face in trying to get the care that they want and need. It's also scary in terms of how the laws, how politics play into the practice of medicine. I read this first with the title in mind, and when I got through it, I said, boy, this is scary on a couple fronts. But again, this is from last week. So despite the advances that we've made, these sorts of things, these disparities exist, real potential to undermine the optimum healthcare that we're looking to provide to all of our patients. All right, so what is allyship? So we went through the history, and I'd like to think that by sitting and listening to the history, you are on the road to being an ally. So an ally is not somebody who says, you know, I feel for you, I'm there, I support what it is that you do. Allyship really involves an active role in well, as you'll see in a second, I have one more video to show you on what is allyship.
But let me start first of all by framing what I mean by allyship. Because the term is thrown around and I want us all to be on the same page. What does that actually mean, especially as it relates to a workplace or leadership context? So when we are an ally, what happens is that we don't self-identify as coming from a particular community or a group or a tribe. I use that term comfortably and deliberately. We don't identify as being part of a community of people, but we identify as being someone who stands next to the community or behind the community, never in front of the community. So we stand next to or behind the community as a friend, as an advocate, as a supporter, as a champion, as a mentor, or a sponsor. So we may not identify as being a woman, identify as being trans, identify as being a person of color, identify as being an Indigenous person, identify as being a millennial, identify as being a Muslim, and so much more. We may not identify as coming from a community that has been historically and currently experiences marginalization. However, we stand next to these communities, providing our support. We stand behind these communities, providing our support, our friendship. It's almost like we're there as family, to back, to support, to advocate for their advancement, to provide them with whatever they need in that moment to be elevated. Allyship is a role. It's a role we actually step into. It's a choice. We choose to step into this role. It can be both very visible, but it can also be behind the scenes. And this is really important because as we initially step into this role, we choose to do so. For a lot of us, especially because as a man, we've not had a lot of experience being vocal about advocating for women, or as a white person, we've not used our voice directly before in advocating for people of color and people from the Indigenous communities. Or as a straight person or a cisgender person, we may not have been as vocal before in the past in helping to support people who from the LGBTQ communities and more. And initially, it may be hard for us to be very visible in our activity. So as an ally, we can also be behind the scenes. We can also be providing that advocacy and that support behind the scenes.
All right, so an active role, all right? It's a formal, active role with responsibilities. As the person in that video stated, direct, visible, and behind. She said standing beside, standing behind, but not standing in front. It's being vocal, it's being inclusive, and it's also being educated. So there are many steps to what an ally really does. It's a very formal role, an active role that I'd say, you know, in my opinion, it really involves a lot of introspection to know where you come from. It really involves a lot of education. So you really know, you know, like I said, history. You know how formal steps in being an ally and being in this sometimes difficult active role. All right. It's being culturally competent, culturally, it's having cultural humility, knowing the history. You know, it's assuming that when you are with people, because, you know, we really don't always know, but it's assuming that somebody, the person you're talking with, or perhaps there's somebody that is with the person that you're talking with, assume the presence of somebody from the LGBTQ plus community. It's speaking up. You know, there's a whole, it's a whole nother, not just lecture, but a whole nother process on, well, how do you actually speak up when it's often very difficult to do, but it's important to consider speaking up because silence is consent. And it's also being personal. What is your connection to being an ally? And again, these are very general statements, but it's speaking up for respect and inclusion. Inclusion is really it's recognizing a person for their entire identity, not most of somebody's identity, but their entire identity. This takes practice and education so that you can speak with composure and confidence, that you are clear and concise. You have to be careful of not blaming or not, guilt shaming people, being non-judgmental. So you can see all of the active pieces that require lots of practice. Most of us, and I will include myself in this, aren't good at this or can always improve in this. So it really does require an active participation in the process. You know, you've been there. You know, on the one hand, you want to speak up. On the other hand, you're afraid if you speak up, maybe you misinterpreted something. Maybe you think you're going to make it worse. This is the struggle that we often go through. Well, being an ally means doing it, speaking up for what's right, speaking up for respect. And again, I just want to leave you with this idea that of silent collusion. If you are silent, you are in agreement with and approval of a microaggression that may have been committed. So just keep that in mind. It's a whole process on how you actually are successful at doing this, but just keep this in mind, silent collusion. We do this at Jefferson. So we have tools that we have for our entire organization. We use these tools when we're teaching students, residents, faculty. Here's a list of some of our educational videos. We actually require all of our employees to take this. Anyone can be an ally, inclusion in action, defeating unconscious bias. To be an ally means to take an active role, to actively participate in modules such as this, because you're trying to learn and you're trying to pick up the tools that will make it better for you to actually stand up and speak for respect and inclusion. It takes preparation and practice. Right? This doesn't come to us naturally. You've got to be knowledgeable. You have to prepare. You've got to practice this in advance. And there are steps on how to speak up. An ally. So I read this somewhere, and I'm trying to remember exactly where I read this, but sometimes being an ally. So imagine that you are on one of those moving walkways. All right. So we're all moving along in a certain way. Sometimes being an ally, or I should say oftentimes being an ally can be difficult. It can feel as if you are walking against that moving walkway. So think about that. That's how difficult it can sometimes be to be an ally. Yet it's so important. It's so important that we do this for each other. It's important that we're doing this to set our environment. When we think about patient care in our environment, it's important that we set our environment. We want it to be as inclusive as possible. And that takes work. When we are as inclusive as possible, we can then be as inclusive as possible for the patients that we care for. So I'm hoping that you got a little bit of, or actually probably a lot of history. That's part of the knowledge, part of the education in order to become a good ally. I hope I've given you some words on what it actually means to be an ally and some steps to think about. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Again, hopefully this was a useful celebration for Pride Month. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for such an informative presentation that gave us all a lot of great things to think about and a lot of education built in. So now for the audience questions, we encourage you to submit all of your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll be serving as the moderator, fielding some questions to Dr. Lopez so we can get those answered. We only have a few minutes left, but be sure to get them in because if we don't get it answered live, we will provide a written response. So feel free to use that button at the bottom of your screen. So to get us started, we do have an audience member who would like to hear about maybe one of your experiences serving as an ally in one of the disadvantaged communities that you work in. Kind of, you said, it can be a little uncomfortable, but like, when did you really step out of, your comfort zone and say something that you didn't think was right?
Well, I like to think that I've been doing this all of my life. When I look back, I say, no, I haven't been doing it all of my life. I've certainly gotten a lot better. I think it's part of my job as the diversity person on the academic side is to be that role model. Sometimes it's just as simple as when I overhear something, one person says something to another, it turns out to be a microaggression. Sometimes it's just speaking up and saying that's not right. In some way to get the point across. I think about an event that happened in our medical school. Again, to sum it up, it was a microaggression by one of our students against the transgender community. A whole process behind that, but I ended up sending an email to the entire medical school class to talk about what does it mean when you deny somebody their identity. It took a little bit of work because I wanted to make sure that I worded it right, but it was important not to just say, oh, he didn't really mean it. I'm sure he meant well, but it was one of those times when it was just the right thing to do, was to speak up for at least our students, perhaps for an entire community. And the hope was that some education happened for the people that actually took a look at that email.
That's great to really kind of help and get out of that silence and not necessarily condone. And for those who are looking for further education that maybe aren't part of the Jefferson staff and faculty or a student here, where can they find these resources? Where would you advise that they go to get further training and education on how to become a better ally?
What comes to mind, I had to think about that one. We develop our own within, but you're right, outside, well, it's easy for me. We've got all the resources and we can kind of pick and choose. Fenway is a good one. They have a lot of educational programs. That's probably the one that most people would say, hey, if you're looking for one, that might be a group. Human Rights Campaign can often be a resource. If you're looking for something specific to medicine, healthcare, the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association. So, you have to be careful about just saying, well, I'm going to go on Google and just put it in and I'll pick the first thing that comes through. But those are some organizations that one can start with, looking for resources that may help.
Thank you. We'll have to definitely look into those. So this is kind of our last question. It's a really great way to kind of sum everything up. They want to know, what is your advice? We've heard this wonderful webinar. What do we do tomorrow? What's the next step?
The next step is, so I look at it this way. You want to be an ally. All right. Now, I'll focus this on healthcare. All right. All of us who went into healthcare, well, we got into this because we wanted to help people. We wanted to help whole people, not parts of people. You know, I think about the work that I do. I'm here to make it as best as possible for the person that I'm caring for. All right. And that requires me to be educated about all of the parts of what make a person. It requires me to look at myself. How do I treat other people? What are my biases? What are ways that, what are the things that are preventing me from providing that best care? So what's the next step? Think about what it means. And if I focus on LGBTQ plus community, you heard some of the history. You heard we'll call them the atrocities over the years. Think about what that has done in terms of disparities. Well, we're here to help people. We're here to get rid of those disparities. So what's your next step? Think about that. Think about how you can help your fellow human being, and think of it in terms for this talk, LGBTQ plus community. Really, you can think about it the same way for all groups that are in the minority, groups that are not in power, groups that are marginalized.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, again, for a really wonderful presentation and for a great Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Galaria, for that wonderful introduction. And to our SKMC I.D.E.A subcommittee, we are so excited to see what you bring to as far as programming and wonderful education opportunities. Before we end tonight, I just wanted to share a few announcements. So we have these on the screen. We have a wonderful Jefferson Alumni Network, and I encourage, if you haven't already created a profile, please feel free to visit the website that you'll see on the screen or scan that QR code and set up your profile. It's a really great way to connect with your fellow alumni, to search our directory. There's a lot of other things that you can utilize on that. And we have some really great online programming still coming up over the summer. We've listed a few of the ones on your screen, and we're also having our in-person events coming back. So if you'd like more information about any of our online programs or any of our in-person events, please visit our website, jefferson.edu/alumni events. And you can see our full calendar and the RSVP links there. So with that, I would like to thank you again for all attending tonight's presentation. We hope you stay well, stay safe, and we hope to see you again. Take care.